This is the final part of the history of the Somali Republic. If you have not already seen part 1 and 2, I suggest you do, as you will get a better insight into the history of modern Somali state building. As previously mentioned, the state of Somalia and the state of Somaliland united to form the Somali Republic. However, the Act of Union passed by Somalia's parliament was rejected by Somaliland's parliament. This is because they felt they did not have a fair deal. For example, the distribution of political posts was not fair. In 1961, young officers from Somaliland planned and carried out a military coup, but they failed. They were arrested but later acquitted by a British judge. As you know from the last video, the country's name changed from the Somali Republic to the Somali Democratic Republic. The Somali Republic also invested in supporting Djibouti in its liberation from France. Additionally, the Somali Republic also supported Eritrea in its war of independence against Ethiopia.
We have now been officially notified that the Secretary General has been unable to obtain a reply from the government of France regarding arrangements for a United Nations presence before and a United Nations supervision during the holding of the referendum in French Somaliland. Mr. Chairman, less than 2 weeks separate us from the referendum to be held on Sunday, the 19th of March. This committee, because of its mandate, is one of the most important bodies of the World Organization. I am certain that it will not shrink from its responsibilities towards a territory which is relatively small in comparison with its neighbors, but which merits its attention no less than any other land or any other people. One of the petitioners, Mr. Abdurrahman Ahmed Hassan, who had himself been politically detained in a prison in French Somaliland from 1959 to 1965, testified before the committee on 6th October 1966 that in the 2 months following President de Gaulle's visit to Djibouti last August, over 3,000 persons had been arrested. Another petitioner, Mr. Dahan, reiterated the complaints about political suppression, including the absence of effective trade unions and of freedom of action for political parties, youth organizations, and women's organizations. Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, the harsh policies described by the petitioners early in October 1966 before this committee continue to be applied by the French authorities in the territory even during the remainder of the 21st session of the General Assembly. On 9th December, the Somali delegate advised the Fourth Committee of the General Assembly that between August and November 1966, almost 6,000 men, women, and children, almost all destitute, had come from the territory into the Somali Republic. Since November, the number has increased to more than 8,000. The greater majority had been arbitrarily expelled by the police, while some had felt compelled to cross the border for fear of persecution in the territory. This is a serious situation and a grave indictment against the policies of the local French colonial administration. The vast majority of the expellees are bona fide citizens of the territory. Many of them were in possession of their identity papers at the time of their expulsion, while others were not even allowed time to go to their homes to fetch their documents. From the statements given by them and by the evidence of their political leaders, it appears that the expulsions have taken place for the purpose of political intimidation and because the local authorities believe these persons would have voted no at the forthcoming referendum. In addition to the political injustice of the situation, there is the question of the well-being of these unfortunate refugees. Their problem is so serious that the Somali government has been obliged to call on international humanitarian organizations, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, for assistance in providing a means of existence for them. My government has made several representations on the matter to the French government, but there has been no satisfactory response.
That of the Red Sea coastline is called Eritrea. Do you support the struggle of the liberation fronts in Eritrea for independence?
Well, I told you, we always support those who are fighting for their freedom. We are against anybody or any state who oppress people and refuse their freedom. Whatever it costs, we always support that principle, and we believe it's right.
And this goes for Eritrea as well?
Certainly.
Between 1973 and 1975, there was a major, devastating drought that affected northern Somali Republic. The drought caused major loss of livestock and widespread famine. Moreover, the Soviet Union, which at the time maintained a strategic relations with the Somali Republic, airlifted around 90,000 people from the area impacted by the drought and relocated them to the south.
Arid land, dry scrub, and the camps of refugees affected by drought. It's a picture that has become familiar throughout the whole of northern Africa over the past couple of years, as the shortage of rainfall has killed crops and livestock right across the continent. This film comes from one of the countries most badly affected, the Somali Democratic Republic. More than 1 million Somalis, out of a population of just over 3 million, have been forced by the drought to seek government assistance and international aid just to keep alive. And camps like this one near Drought are now scattered throughout the country.
In 1977, the Somali National Army, along with the Western Somali Liberation Movement, waged a war against Ethiopia for the purpose of liberating Somali native territories. The Somali forces captured most of the Somali territories and were victorious against the Ethiopian army. However, the Soviet Union, which also formed relations with Ethiopia, disapproved of the invasion and offered to mediate a solution for both parties. CAD Barry refused and ordered all Soviet citizens and politicians to leave the country. CAD Barry also switched alliances from the Soviet Union to the USA. However, the USA did not provide military support to the Somali army, whereas Ethiopia received military support from Cuba and other countries such as South Yemen, as well as Soviet military advisors. By March 1978, the Somali National Army were defeated with heavy casualties. Some Somali military commanders believed they lost the war due to political weakness.
Away from the square, the symbolic lion of Ethiopia with teeth of spent cartridges is now surmounted by a liberation soldier. In our 500-mile tour of the Ogaden, we saw no sign of an Ethiopian presence, just the aftermath of their leaving. The key to the Ethiopian collapse in the Ogaden lay here at Gode. 120 miles from the Somali border, it was, amid the poverty of the region, a palatial airbase with a runway big enough to land a jumbo. Its American-made anti-aircraft guns are now manned by men from the Liberation Front. The Ethiopians didn't make much of a fight for it. They left a feast of unused American-supplied rockets and bombs, and beyond, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of weapons and ammunition. The American sign of friendship underlined the source. For though that bond of alliance has now been broken by the Ethiopians, there was no sign here that the new Soviet replacements had started to get through when Gode fell 6 weeks ago. But pride of place for the liberation forces here was not the airbase, but what was once Haile Selassie's provincial palace. Now riddled with bullet holes, only the old man's effigy in cast iron survives intact. On the way from Gode, an Ethiopian civil airliner brought down by rebel gunfire 2 months before the August victories. Suspected by the liberation forces of being a troop carrier, the telltale state of the planes inside revealed that Ethiopia had indeed used her civil airline to ferry troops. Between each garrison town, there are virtually no roads. There is, in fact, little sign of Ethiopian investment beyond the vast military expenditure that was needed to maintain their hold on the Ogaden. The burnt-out shell of an American-supplied Ethiopian tank here at Kebri Dahar and 3 charred bodies inside bear witness to more of a fight here in what was the Ethiopian Army's Ogaden divisional headquarters. Once again, the ammunition and plenty of hardware still intact. But around the hilltops, more devastation. The aftermath of a battle in which the now Soviet-backed Ethiopians had to use old American-supplied weapons against a liberation movement now no longer supported by the Russians, but still armed by them. And beyond the debris and the barbed wire, the nomadic peoples around whom it is all being fought. Amid the giant anthills, we came across them with their camels and flocks, some of the remotest people in Africa. But even here, the shepherds police their flocks with guns. Even here, they know about the war and feel about it too. At the next town of Galadi, under massive guard, 200 Ethiopian soldiers captured in the fighting there. Unhappy, disillusioned faces. There were many who, when they joined the army in Addis Ababa, can have had little idea that this would be how it would end. For thousands of their colleagues have now died, or like them been captured in Ethiopia's wars, both here and in Eritrea to the north.
Anti-Soviet demonstrations in Somalia greeted the government's decision to send the Russian advisors and their families back to Moscow. All Soviet support was now switched to Ethiopia. The Soviet Union began shipping in weapons and 15,000 troops to fight in Ethiopia. The troops were Cuban.
It was the only operation we conducted in full agreement with the Soviets. No such cooperation took place even in Latin America. Quite the opposite.
The Cuban troops in Ethiopia played a very important role. The Ethiopians couldn't have provided the military organization to destroy the Somali troops in such a short period of time, even with our help.
With Cuban troops and Soviet support, the Ethiopians drove the Somalis out of the Ogaden. But Moscow wouldn't let the troops advance into Somalia.
Among the Soviet military, we thought about occupying Somalia. But the Soviet government was right not to allow this, because it would have made our relations with countries like the United States of America, Great Britain, and others more difficult.
The commanders who have been involved in the fighting around Hara painted a picture of appalling carnage. They talked of a massive Cuban and Soviet-backed Ethiopian bombing and shelling offensive which started a week ago, of battles in which they had seen no infantry on the other side, of listening in to Russian radio communications from tank to tank, and of barrages of heavy artillery advancing towards them. They talked of the swamping of Somali positions around Hara, and for the first time of tactical withdrawals on their side. One commander talked of having seen white men, possibly Russians, killed in the action. A number of Cubans, too. Private Orlando Carlos is 20. He was captured when his 7-man Cuban unit came under Somali attack. He appears to have been the only one to have survived. Talking to him, he appeared far more concerned about what his masters in Havana might think of him than what the liberation forces might do to him. Alone, under heavy guard, ready to return to his prison, he was at least living proof that Cubans are actively involved in fighting Ethiopia's war. The Somalis see his presence as a sharp reminder of the level of the Soviet and Cuban commitment to return the Ogaden to the Ethiopians. If they succeed, they stand to win rich strategic rewards in the Horn of Africa.
Hargeisa, inside the Somali Democratic Republic, was bombed by Russian MiG aircraft in September 1977.
Coming to terms with defeat at the hands of Cuba and the Soviet Union is presenting very real difficulties. Victory cheering was still the pattern, as in this enormous Chinese-built stadium, the electric scoreboard flashed up the slogans that were to be chanted next. The president's arrival was accompanied by surging security, and as if to divert everyone's mind, a game of football was provided. Though President Barry gave all the appearances of studying the game, his mind cannot have been far from the carnage on the battlefront of the past few days and the enormous uncertainties of the future. When the crowd had settled, his speech was of a continued commitment to back the liberation forces in the Ogaden, and only a glancing reference to his forces having been pushed back in certain places. Intensive behind-the-scenes bargaining is going on by both superpowers in a desperate bid to win influence here in the aftermath of a Somali defeat. Staying in room 27 in this hotel behind me, a very senior Algerian diplomat, allegedly with a message from Moscow transmitted via their ally President Boumediene of Algeria. The Russians are, perhaps surprisingly, still here in Mogadishu. Though 3,000 or more were thrown out, an embassy staff of 10 remain, and amongst them, Ambassador Samsonov, chief architect of the Soviet presence here at its peak 3 years ago. It is strongly argued he wouldn't still be here if the Soviets didn't cling to a hope that they can still restore some influence here. Down the road, the Americans too are involved in high-level.
Due to the 1977 war, there was a mass influx of displaced people into Isaac majority cities such as Hargeisa in the Somali Republic. The state became reliant on international aid, and Barre's apparent clan favoritism became obvious, as Barre started arming his clansmen in the north, which then started terrorizing the local Isaac population. This led to animosity and discontent amongst the Isaac population. Loss of trust in the government grew, and in 1981, Somali National Movement was created in London, UK by Isaac experts. Throughout the 1980s, the Somali National Movement carried out guerrilla attacks targeting Siad Barre's regime. In retaliation, Barre's regime created a special unit called Isaac Exterminators. And it's estimated that at least 100,000 Isaac were massacred by 1990. By 1991, SNM defeated the Barre's regime and took control of the whole of Somaliland. By 1991, SNM defeated the Barre's regime and took control of the whole of Somaliland.
Tonight, there's confusion over just how far the SNM rebels have advanced. It seems the town of Barreo was taken temporarily earlier this week. Berbera may also have seen battles, and the road from there to the city of Hargeisa, where most of the aid workers were based, has also, it seems, been attacked. Certainly, the radio station went off the air. The SNM claim they're close to victory in the north, despite a remarkable difference in numbers. It's thought about 3,000 rebels are up against as many as 30,000 government troops.
For quite some time, the rural areas have been under our control, but during the recent offensive, we have taken over most of the urban centers Hargeisa now is in our hands, which is the second capital of the country, and which is the main town in the northern regions. And the second one to that, which is Burao, again a regional capital, and a very, very important and strategic area, and many other district capitals and towns and villages, and all these things are in our hands at the moment.
The Somali government says there's no unrest and no reason for the aid workers to have left at all.
The regions in the north are tranquil. The road connecting Mogadishu with the north is also clear and safe. The traffic has not been hampered even for 1 hour. And many things have been.
These pictures, shot a week later on the rebel side, show members of the SNM moving freely in several areas of Hargeisa, the biggest town in what was once the British-ruled part of Somalia. Captured government military equipment helped the SNM sustain their offensive. The government's efforts to dislodge the rebels have been masterminded by General Morgan, the flamboyant regional army commander seen here during recent field operations. Desertions are said to have sapped army morale and effectiveness. The government used aircraft as well as artillery against the rebels in Hargeisa. The pictures from the rebel side show the consequences of the fighting. An American aid official who's just visited Hargeisa, one of very few foreigners to do so since the evacuation, says a quarter of the town lies in ruins and many more buildings are badly damaged. There have been heavy casualties on both sides and among the civilian population. Eyewitness reports of summary executions of suspected SNM supporters by the army brought condemnation from human rights groups. The current concern is the refugee problem created by the fighting. Most of Hargeisa's estimated population of 250,000 have sought refuge initially in the surrounding countryside. Little or no help has been available there, and the result has been a massive exodus across the border into Ethiopia. Upwards of 4,000 people are reported to be arriving each day at camps that are desperately short of water and have worryingly low stocks of high-energy food for the malnourished.
By the end of 1990, Barre's regime weakened and clan cohesion disintegrated. The United Somali Congress, made up of Hawiye clan, which were anti-Barre's regime, routed Barre's army in the south. In January 1991, following clashes between Barre's regime and local rebels in Mogadishu, Barre fled the country to Kenya, then to Nigeria, where he died in 1995.
In all of this, of course, were the Somali people themselves, most of whom did not benefit in any way from that Cold War competition between the two sides.
One man who did benefit was General CAD Barry. In 1969, he overthrew a weak democracy, set up a military dictatorship, and started playing superpower ping pong. Barry's neighbor, Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie, was backed by the West in the 1970s. So not surprisingly, Barry was embraced by the Soviets. When Selassie was overthrown by a communist dictator, ping-pong politics forced the Americans to court a new ally, Somalia's strongman, CAD Barry. Barry cared little about cutting old ties and switching alliances. As long as someone supplied him with weapons, he'd have the power to do whatever he wanted to his people. He ruled from Mogadishu, his capital in the south, favoring his own clan, the Droughts. Barry had some Isaks in top positions, including the notorious head of the prison system, but that didn't stop him from trying to crush Isak nationalism in the north. All-out civil war eventually erupted in 1988, when a mainly Isak resistance group called the Somali National Movement, the SNM, briefly seized Hargeisa and other towns. Barry ordered Soviet MiG jets and American-built tanks to level the cities. But it wasn't enough to save his regime. In January of last year, Barry fled to Kenya. His bodyguards gunned down and left to rot outside the presidential palace. In the north, the Isaks inherited a dying land. In Hargeisa, once home to 500,000 people, 50,000 were killed.
Therefore, I believe, not because I believe, but I am the president of Somali Democratic Republic. Do you plan to return to Mogadishu? Yes. I plan to return to Mogadishu in order to bring back the peace and security and justice among the people.
Following a conference held in a city called Drought, Somaliland reinstated its independence on 18th of May 1991. On the other hand, Somalia disintegrated into full-scale civil war that still affects some parts of Somalia.